So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining now the third part of my webinar series on Microsoft Graph API with OutSystems. We have a very interesting topic on subscribing to Microsoft 365 Graph API events. And as usual, we start with some theory first, so you all can still relax. So where we talk about what are Microsoft Graph API subscriptions and what type of events or notifications you can consume when subscribing to events from Graph API. We talk about the subscription lifecycle. And after we stepped into the technical implementation, we also discussed some best practices on how to consume Graph API event notifications. So theory first, and one question could be, is it necessary that I have joined or watched the recordings of the previous webinars? It's actually not necessary. I think you will get along. But nevertheless, if you find some time, you should review the previous two parts of the webinar series on my YouTube channel, which deals about how to get access to Microsoft Graph API and to consume resources, either using as an application or on behalf of a user. The slides I'm presenting you will find in the files section or in the chat. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, please use the QA section, post your question there, and I will answer or try to answer the questions after the webinar. During the webinar, I cannot review the questions, so I ask for patience, but we will do that afterwards. Yeah. Graph API event subscriptions is basically, don't call me, I will call you. So what you do is that in your application, you subscribe to specific resource events. So a resource is, for example, an Outlook message or all Outlook messages, Outlook personal contacts, Microsoft Teams chat messages, and lots of other resources you can subscribe to and get a so-called webhook back to your application for specific events, like when something was created or when a resource was updated or deleted. So Microsoft Graph API is or spans across all Microsoft 365 services. And gives you a central REST API to automate things across all those Microsoft 365 and some Azure services. Unfortunately, not yet you can subscribe to all Graph API resources with the subscriptions. You will find a link to the available resource types within the slide deck in the additional materials section. But most of the interesting stuff is already included. And just a note aside, so if you're watching the recording of this webinar, please take note that Microsoft Graph API and especially subscribing to Graph API event subscriptions evolve nearly every week. So what you hear now may not be true later on when you watch the recording. Okay, so how does it work on a abstract level? So you decide for a resource you want to get notified whenever it is created or updated and deleted, and you subscribe to this resource using a subscription endpoint from Microsoft Graph API. Then if Graph API accepts your subscription, and it could validate your so-called webhook endpoint, then it starts sending event notifications. And every subscription has a life cycle. So that means a subscription automatically expires and gets deleted if the subscription lifetime expiry was met. And there is also a resource subscription lifetime limit. You will find the link here. So that's the maximum lifetime limit of a subscription. Or if the access token that subscribed to a certain resource expires. So in the end, if you do not deal with this type of lifecycle notifications, meaning you will get another webhook whenever the subscription is about to expire, and if you do not deal with this type of notification, then a subscription automatically expires and gets automatically deleted. And for sure, what you can also do, you can unsubscribe anytime you want using a REST consume action. And then again, the subscription automatically gets deleted and no further change notifications are sent to your application. So there are two types of events you can consume. One is called a basic notification. So you subscribe to a resource for a specific event type, create, update, delete. And what you get as notification is just the event type and the resource identifier of the affected resource. When consuming rich notifications, the notification itself does include additional data. So you specify when subscribing to an event specific attributes of the resource you want to be a part of the payload. And this is then directly sent with a notification, but in an encrypted manner. So that payload, the attributes you have chosen with their values are encrypted by a public key. You have to send when subscribing to a specific resource. And then you have to decrypt it on your own using the private key of the corresponding public key in order to use the values and the attributes of the payload. Lifecycle events, there are 3 lifecycle events you will receive, but only if you have chosen to subscribe to lifecycle events as well. So one is missed. So whenever Microsoft Graph API is not able to deliver a notification to your application, it will retry it again. So that is a stepped retry. So it takes a few seconds, then it does a retry, does another retry, does another retry, and then it just stops sending that notification and tries a missed notification to your lifecycle endpoint. And this includes, again, the affected resource identifier and the action. And you can handle this missed notification however you want. So you can query that resource and do stuff, whatever. However, this missed notification is currently only available for Outlook messages, events, so calendar events, and personal contacts. So no other resource is at the moment supporting this missed lifecycle events notification. Reauthentication required, that's the most important one if you want to extend the lifetime of a subscription. A reauthorization required event is sent to your application whenever the access token that subscribed to a notification is about to expire, or when the subscription itself, so the subscription lifetime is about to expire, or when someone else, like a tenant administrator, revoked permissions for your application. So in that case, you will receive this type of notification, and you can decide to reauthorize and update the subscription to extend its lifetime. It's the most important one. Okay. And subscription is removed. That is triggered whenever a subscription is removed from Graph API. It is not triggered when a subscription automatically expires because you did not handle the reauthorization required. So in that case, you get nothing. But if someone else, so for example, another application is removing your subscription, you get a subscription removed notification and you can handle it. But again, this is only available for Outlook messages, events, contacts, personal contacts, and Teams chat messages. So subscribing, and if you have watched the previous webinars on Graph API, in order to consume Graph API, you need an access token. And there are two types of access token available, or you can use. One is an application access token, which you retrieve using a client credential OAuth 2 flow. So just rewatch the webinar if the terms are new for you. And that application needs some specific application permissions. For example, if you want to subscribe to mail events, your application needs the right mail read in order to subscribe to change notifications from emails. And keep in mind that application permissions, they are very, very powerful. The best example is always granting an application access to read emails that by default gives that application the right to read from all mailboxes in your whole organization. And you have to take additional measures to limit that permissions down to what you really want to have. And one measure is called using managed roles. We do not cover this in this webinar, but you may look it up in the Graph API documentation or in the Microsoft Entra documentation, how to configure and use managed roles to limit down permissions on certain resources. Okay. Application permissions is the easiest way to get started. So you subscribe to a resource using an access token, and you can basically retrieve a new access token with every new subscription you do. And whenever you receive a reauthorization required lifecycle event, you just get a new access token using the client credential flow, and then you reauthorize and update a subscription. We will see how this works when we step into the technical implementation. Now, more complicated but more useful is using a delegated access token. That is, a user grants your application the right to act on her or his behalf. So this, or in order to get a delegated access token, you need to perform an authorization code, OAuth 2 flow. That's the flow where a user has to use a browser and input his credentials at the Microsoft Entra identity provider, and maybe some multi-factor authentication or whatever. And in this scenario, using a delegated token, you cannot, so whenever you receive a reauthorization required lifecycle event, you cannot just get a new access token using the authorization code flow every time, because this would involve the user sitting in front of a browser and inputting his credentials every time. So you want to do that silent, and in that case, you need to use a refresh token, which you get when you add that offline access permission to your application registration. And then you use the refresh token to get an updated access token, which you then use to update your subscription using Graph API. Okay, for the implementation, so that was somehow the theory part. For the technical implementation, if you want to do this on your own in your environment, make sure you have access to your or any Azure tenant using the Azure portal, and you need at least this cloud application administrator role to register an application and to grant all that permissions that are necessary to consume Graph API. And this is very special in regards to consuming rich notifications. You need access to PowerShell to generate a public-private key pair for that rich notifications thing. We'll do that in a bit. I created a demo application, and I will publish it right after the webinar on Forge, which you can use to so hopefully you can use it as a reference implementation, but take care that this is a reduced demo application. So in a productive environment, you definitely want to change lots of things here inside. But quickly stepping through is we have a UI I show in a bit. Then we have some sort of business logic who does all the magic and orchestrating all the other stuff here. We have one core service that is used to get a new access token from Microsoft Entra. Another core service for just storing all the subscriptions we have. And then some integration modules. One is some of you should remember for getting access tokens from an identity provider. So this is a component I made available on Forge. And then 2 REST API consume integrations for the mail endpoint of Graph API, and 1 for the subscriptions endpoint of Graph API. So the mail endpoint just has a single action for getting message details, and the subscription is for creating new subscriptions, deleting subscriptions, updating subscriptions. And then a special utility, it's just a custom code extension for decrypting rich notifications. So that's the demo application. And this slide here is just for your reference. That's the script for generating a private public key pair using PowerShell. It took me a while to figure that out. And that's it. So we jump right to the technical implementation, starting off with showing you the application front page. So that's the demo application, and with a single form where you can enter an email address, and that email address can be your personal mailbox. It can be a resource mailbox, a shared mailbox in your Exchange Online environment. I created one which I called Action Mails. Okay, and on the left side we see messages, so mail messages, which have been received using a webhook. So for the moment, you have to believe me that the messages here are not a call to Graph API. But the messages here are retrieved via webhooks. Okay. So what you have to do in advance is you have to register an application in your Azure tenant. So I guess you remember that from the previous webinars. I already prepared one. And this one has permissions to read mails in all mailboxes. So that's the downside of application permissions. By default, this application now has access to all the mailbox within my organization. And here you see this offline access thing. That is a special permission you need for delegated access tokens to get a refresh token. So keep that in mind. If you want to use a delegated access token, you need this offline access permission to get a refresh token. And only with a refresh token, you can get a new access token silently without user interaction. Okay, so this is what you need. I created as well some shared mailboxes just for demonstration purposes in the Exchange Admin Center. So that's a regular shared mailbox I'm using just to demonstrate everything. And yeah, that's basically all of the preparational stuff you have to do for the moment. Later on, we do another thing when we create that public-private key for rich notifications. Back in the demo application, as you see, we have some functions here. We have some features here. One is the add subscription. One is to delete all messages, just to clean this up. To refresh, which just refreshes data from an entity. And we can also delete an already created subscription, both from our own database and Graph API. Okay, now everyone's waiting for Service Studio to come up. Okay, so all these actions on the front end relate to one public server action in the business. Oops, sorry. In the business logic module. So in the business logic module, we have public actions for adding a subscription, removing a subscription, and wipe that messages. So these are the three you can consume from the front end. And adding a subscription takes in the UPN. That's the principal name of a mailbox. So in this case, or in my case, the email address of the mailbox. You may want to check with your Azure AD administrators or Entra administrators what's the UPN for specific resources is. And walking through this server action, so we are creating a subscription now. And in order to create a subscription, the first thing we need is we need an access token. And this access token is consumed, or this retrieval of an access token is consumed from the Entra token service module. Just opening that up. Which does, it checks that action, it just checks if there is already a valid access token available. So in a token cache, you see here. And if not, it requests a new token from Microsoft Entra using a client credential flow. And that client credential flow takes in your token endpoint URL and your client ID and client secret from the Azure AD app registration, and the default scope, which is in our case the default permission scope for Microsoft Graph API. It returns an access token. So if everything went fine, it just returns an access token, stores it in the cache, and returns it back to our business logic module. And then it creates, so we skip that for the moment, then it creates a subscription. And that subscription includes now, it includes a resource type. So we are interested in whenever an email is created in that mailbox. And an email is created in the mailbox when I send an email to that mailbox. So then it's created. We define a expiration date for our subscription. So that is how long is that subscription valid until it expires. So in my case, I'm just setting this to 15 minutes. Okay. And then, and that is the most important part, is we define the target of the event receiver. So that is that event receiver is a REST expose. I show in a bit, which receives the notification from Graph API whenever something is created. And the second important thing is, and this is optional, is another REST expose, which takes or which receives all lifecycle events. So if you do not add that lifecycle notification URL to your request, then you don't get any lifecycle events. That means the subscription automatically expires when that expiration date and time is hit. Okay, so this creates it, and this subscription created just stores it in the database. So now we have a running subscription, which is not yet, but close to ready to receive notifications from Graph API. Because when you create a new subscription and when you create a new subscription, Graph API first validates your notification endpoint. So that is in that Graph Event Subscription API module. And we have one exposed REST endpoint for receiving our events. That's the hook. And one endpoint for receiving lifecycle events. And when you subscribe, Graph API sends out a validation token. Okay, that validation token, so that's the first call. So no notification, it's just a validation call to your exposed REST endpoint. And that validation token must be returned in the response before Graph API activates that subscription. And as you see, okay, this is now the least or the most minimal thing you can do in validating your endpoint. So what I do is, if the request includes a validation token, then it just returns in the result. So that's just a text. It returns just the validation token back. And then Graph API activates that subscription. Okay. So having that subscription now active, the next thing is that hopefully Graph API is now sending notifications back to your application. And those are handled, or those notifications come in a specific structure. So what you get with every notification is a list of so-called validation tokens. Talk about it in a minute. And a list of change notifications. And that change notifications include the change type, which is in our case, so we are only subscribing to create events from a mailbox. It's always create. A client state. talk about it in a minute. If it is a rich notification, it includes an encrypted content. ID, that's a unique ID of this notification. And then more important is this one here, that resource data, which includes the affected resource of this notification. And this events here, that is a list. So there are situations when you're consuming lots of notifications, you do not get every notification one by one. So there is a chance that you receive a bunch of change notifications in a single endpoint call. So that's why it is a list. And then what happens here is we iterate that events of that payload and validate that subscription first. And this validation is just validating the state, this here, the client state, with something you have stored in your environment. So the state is something you sent when subscribing. And I'm storing this in, hold on. So what I'm using for the client state is just the ID field of a subscription. So this one, so that's the ID. And I compare that ID with the ID of, with a given client state, which is sent via Graph API. And if it is valid, I just return true and say it is validated. So that's the simplest validation you can do. So just validating this client state with something you have stored in your environment. And if not, you just terminate with an authorization exception or with an exception. There is another thing you might want to consider is with every request, you get one or more validation tokens. So these are JSON Web Tokens, signed JSON Web Tokens. And you may also want to validate those as well. So in, let's say, higher security environments, it makes sense to validate those JSON Web Tokens. Not part of this webinar, but you will find information on validating tokens in one of my articles on how to expose REST services with OpenID Connect and OAuth. So there you will find information on how to validate those access tokens. Okay, if it is valid, then we create that message. And that message, there are two types now. So we have a basic notification, so no encrypted payload, and a rich notification. The basic notification is quite simple. We only have the ID of a message, but we do not have the content. So in that case, adding a message, what we do is that we query now Graph API with a new access token we received, and using the affected resource ID. So that's the only thing we have. And that query returns now all the attributes that are part of a message resource. That's quite a lot. So if you look in the Graph Mail IS module, that get message, the response contains the BCC, the whole body, a body preview, categories, if it is a draft, and so forth. So lots of attributes from that message resource, okay? And that's basically the flow it generates. So what happens here is it gets the message and then it stores the message in our database, and then you can click the refresh button in the demo application to see it in the UI. Okay, so that's the part for basic notifications. For rich notifications, things are a little bit more complicated. When subscribing to rich notifications, then you need to add here. You need to add to your subscription request a public key. Okay, and that public key can be generated using that PowerShell script I was showing. And in the demo application, it is stored in a site property. So this here is the content of the public key, and this one is the private key. So the PowerShell scripts generates both parts, the public and the or the private key and the corresponding public key, and you just copy it here. Don't store a private key in site properties. So you should use something secure. And if you have the most recent version of OutSystems, you might have access you may already have access to this is secret setting, which encrypts everything, which is good. But encrypted properties in OutSystems have a length limit, and a private key will not make it into that length limit. So potentially you store this in the database in an encrypted manner. You can review the first part of the webinar where I'm showing, I would say, a simple way in how to encrypt secrets within OutSystems using the environment's private key. Okay, but site properties is not the solution. But for the demo, it's just plain text. So you need both of them. You send the public key together with your subscription request, and then, very interesting, whenever you receive now an encrypted payload, then you open that up. Then you need to decrypt that encrypted payload to get to the values, to get to the actual decrypted payload. And what this component does, so that's the extension I published on Forge for decrypting it. It takes the encrypted content and the data key, which is also part of the payload. It uses the private key to extract a symmetric key from that provided data key. And then it uses the symmetric key to decrypt the content. Okay, I had to rethink that as well. But that's the way. So you get an encrypted symmetric key, one-time symmetric key with your encrypted payload. You use the private key to decrypt the symmetric key, and then you use the symmetric key to decrypt the payload. And that payload comes back as a JSON string, and then you can deserialize it into a structure and then create the message. So the structure is much shorter. So it just contains the subject, the body preview, and the from the payload. And this is a very important thing to note, that when you query Graph API for one message, you get, by default, you get all the messages. or the message attributes, let's call it that way. When consuming or when you're subscribing for a rich notification, let me just show you how that works at subscription. When you subscribe for a rich notification, you have to specify every single field you want to have in your encrypted payload. So if you just subscribe to the messages, it will not work. So Graph API will refuse that subscription because you have to explicitly define every single attribute you want to be part of the encrypted payload. And if you're unsure what that is, you can always go to the Graph Explorer and check, for example, going here, doing this. So this is one sample where it retrieves all messages from my mailbox with a filter importance set to high, and we can run that query. And we can also go ahead and select just the from, and then what we get is every message in my mailbox, but just the from attribute. So this is how you can try it out before constructing your resource endpoint in your subscription. Okay. So, and that's why the structure here only contains these 3 attributes. So the subject, body, preview, and from, because that's the only fields I'm consuming when using rich notifications. Okay. And yeah, that's basically everything. So handling basic notifications and handling rich notifications. So basic notifications is you have to initiate another query from Graph API to get the message details. And with rich notifications, you have to decrypt the payload, the encrypted payload, to get the details. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so unsubscribing, so removing a subscription is pretty simple. So if you want to remove it on your own, actually there are 2 ways. You can just terminate, or you just skip to handle the lifecycle events, then it will auto-remove automatically. If you want to do it on your own, you remove it via REST endpoint for unsubscribing, just giving the subscription ID, and then then that subscription automatically terminates, doesn't send any new events. And if you do it on your own, please note that you do not get that lifecycle event for subscription removed. So if you do it on your own, you don't get that lifecycle event. Okay. Now, going back to the second endpoint, which receives that lifecycle events. So, and this is only applicable if you have specified a lifecycle notification endpoint URL when subscribing. Again, lifecycle endpoints must be validated. Same situation, you get a validation token, and then you return the validation token. Then that lifecycle endpoint is activated. The request is pretty much similar to what you get when you consume a resource event. So you get 1 or more events, lifecycle events. So again, here, if you have lots of events in your environment, you typically get always a a batch of events transmitted to your endpoints. You use the client state to verify if that event is really something you have subscribed to. And then you're going to handle the individual events. So in this demo application, I just handle 2 types of events. So not the missed event. We have the subscription removed, which just deletes the subscription from the database. And then we have that reauthorization required. And this is pretty important. So whenever our subscription is about to expire, what we do is that we just get a new access token. We can do that with client credential flow. And then we do a subscription renewal. So that's a call to Graph API with the given subscription ID and a new expiration date and time. So in the demo application, it's always 15 minutes. So it just extends the lifetime of this subscription by 15 minutes. So very important to set both. And yeah, then the lifetime of this subscription is extended and Graph API is still sending some event notifications. So if you're using a delegated access token, this thing here, this entra get access token must be extended, of course. So you have to check if the access token is valid, and if not, then you have to get the refresh token you have stored in your database. Then you initiate a refresh token to the entra token endpoint URL, get a new access token, store it in your token cache, and use it to renew the subscription. I know that was pretty fast, but I think you will manage to do so when reviewing the second part of this webinar on delegated permissions. Yeah, that's it so far. That's the demo application. And I hope I explained it at least somehow good. We will see. Well, we will see when I go to the Q&A section. Stepping back to our presentation. So although the demo application is using the client credentials flow and an application access token, yeah, you should avoid to do so. It's better to subscribe under delegated permissions to have the correct user permissions in your tenant. Although the client credential flow is much easier to handle because you don't have to deal with this refresh token. If you're subscribing to multiple events, multiple resources, whatever, try to build a single REST API for handle everything and not multiple different endpoints. Makes it much harder to manage. And if you really have very large volumes of subscriptions and events, then you might consider using Azure Event Grid. So Microsoft is offering a partner channel for Azure Event Grid, where you can add your channel, so your tenant, to Azure Event Grid and consume via Azure Event Grid. Grid gives you more possibilities. You can specify additional filters. You can configure Grid to handle all that validation stuff before it hits your endpoint, and so forth. Or you can even go, if you're more on the AWS side, you can create a Lambda function that retrieves a Lambda function URL that retrieves your lifecycle events and hook events and adds to AWS Event Bridge, and then you consume directly from AWS Event Bridge. It is that has some advantages because most likely Event Grid is always available, while it could be that your REST API endpoint in your OutSystems application is not always available. So especially when you update something, then it could be that you hit a timeout and then you retrieve that missed lifecycle events and so forth. Yeah. So if you have large volumes, you might consider this. This is a built-in functionality, and this is what you would have to do on your own. Okay. This is everything gathered. I've shown, links to the various websites on you need to configure and to read up more about Graph API and its subscriptions, and especially reach notifications. And that's it for today. Before we come to this part, let me review the Q&A. If there is anything inside. No questions. Unbelievable. Okay. Then what's coming up? So for the moment, I will not do another part of Graph API, although there are so many topics what I could talk about with Graph API. But I will do 2 other webinars or 1 webinar series on Amazon Bedrock. One is for using knowledge bases, Amazon Bedrock knowledge bases, and one is for Bedrock agents and action groups, of course, both related to OutSystems and how to consume it in OutSystems. So if you have time, how to mitigate the upward reference between Graph API and GraphBL. Yeah. So Melvin just asked how to mitigate the upward reference between Graph API and GraphBL. Graph API is consuming, or the only thing that Graph API is consuming is GraphBL service actions. So an upward reference. Maybe you should clarify that a little bit more, Melvin, because the Graph API, so the expose, the REST expose, is a core service as well. So it's not an integration module. So it's a core service as well. So what it has is that the REST expose module has a side reference to the business logic module and no upward reference. Okay. So if there aren't any more questions, thank you once again for joining, and hope to see you next time. Okay. Oh, hold on. We have a new post. Yeah, it's not a foundation module. So REST expose is actually never a foundation module. Hey, thank you very much. Wish you all the best. Hope to see you next time.